arguments that don't actually have anything to do with whether or not, I should vote affirmative or negative. So just long, extremely verbose story short, just stay concise, stay clear, be as organized as you possibly can, and that'll help me a lot.
All right, thank you.
Parent of a debater for a few years, done quite a bit of judging. Looking forward to a great round.
All righty, thank you.
Sweet.
Yeah, this is first day judging. I think I just really want to see clear, logical arguments. Yeah, good luck.
Thank you so much. All right, I just want to clarify, everyone hears me okay, correct?
Yep, I do.
Okay, perfect. And the judges, good? I just phrased that like a cross-examination question. Alrighty, so
real quick question before we get started. You guys are just timing yourselves right, and we're just doing,
Yes, sir. Yeah,
faith.
we'll be timing ourselves.
Yeah, no problem with me. I'm just making sure that that's what's happening. All right, that's good.
Yeah, only ask that I would have is if you are not speaking at the time, if you could just please mute your side, just maybe help with the background noise. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. Alrighty. So then, assuming everyone's ready, with 6 minutes on the clock, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My great-grandfather came to America from Italy with $19 sewn into the hem of his pants. My grandfather was the first generation to be born in America. They called him the Atom, and that's who I was named after. They were proud to be American. When my mother was a little girl, they didn't let her speak Italian or get her ears pierced so she wouldn't look like, as they put it, a guinea off the boat. While our Italian heritage has shaped my family, we are still fully American. My family has prospered through assimilation. That is why I stand resolved. Culture ought to value assimilation over multiculturalism. My great-grandparents had a dream. They came to America and found common ground in order to work together, live together, and prosper together. This is assimilation. It's focusing on the similarities that define us rather than focusing on the differences that separate us. Oxford Dictionary defines assimilation as the absorption and integration of people, ideas, or culture into a wider society or culture. Assimilation and multiculturalism, however, are not opposites and do coexist in society. From Oxford Dictionary, multiculturalism is the presence of or support for the presence of several distinct cultural groups within society. These are the two primary terms of the resolution, but we can't forget the first term, culture. In fact, the very definition of the word culture highlights the importance of assimilation, defined by Merriam-Webster as a set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterizes an institution or organization. Again, the emphasis is on the word shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices. Merriam-Webster defines the word value as the relative worth, utility, or importance. It's my position that assimilation is simply more important to achieve those shared goals than multiculturalism. One way to determine the relative importance of assimilation and multiculturalism is by looking at the value of prosperity. Merriam-Webster defines prosperity as the condition of being successful or thriving. Prosperity is what every culture strives for, no matter the ideology. Assimilation has two important advantages over multiculturalism to achieve this prosperity. In the first advantage, we will look at assimilation from the perspective of the embracing culture, or those assimilating. The second advantage, we'll look at the assimilation process from the perspective of the incoming culture, or those assimilated. Advantage 1, assimilation benefits the embracing culture. In order for a culture to prosper, that is to succeed, it needs to better itself continually. This occurs through the marketplace of ideas. The marketplace of ideas is a concept by John Stuart Mill and states that through the competition of ideas, the best ideal will survive. Imagine you're in the store grocery shopping, and there are two brands of corn. You look at one brand, see it has several questionable additives, so you put it back on the shelf. You look at the other brand, realize it doesn't have the additives, and put it in your cart. Others follow suit, and the store owner gets rid of the inferior product and replaces it with another brand. 2 weeks later, you see this newest brand of corn and realize it's even better than the one you bought last time. Everyone gains through this competition because the corn gets better and better. In the same way, sharing our ideas, skills, and methods and knowledge lead to better built homes, medicines, and more effective ways of doing everyday tasks. It's through competition that the best ideas and methods are discovered. Without the introduction of new ideas and methods into the marketplace, then the culture would never get better and wouldn't prosper. This is where assimilation comes in. Another definition of assimilation from the same source is the process of taking in and fully understanding information or ideas. Assimilation ensures that all these ideas, skills, and knowledge can compete in the same marketplace so that the embracing culture thrives. But the embracing culture isn't the only culture that benefits. Advantage 2, assimilation benefits the incoming culture. Whether it's learning a new language, getting a job, or getting an education, assimilation must occur so the families of the incoming culture can survive and prosper. Stanford University looked at the effect assimilation had for immigrants during the age of mass migration in the United States. To measure assimilation, they looked at the names of the children of immigrants, saying, quote, "The names that parents choose for their children are collected, offering a revealing window into the cultural assimilation process." Through this analysis, they found that when immigrants valued assimilation, they were more likely to have a job and get an education, saying, quote, "Having an American-sounding name was a badge of assimilation that conferred genuine economic and social benefits. Children with less foreign-sounding names completed more years of schooling, earned more, and were less likely to be unemployed than their counterparts whose names sounded more foreign." This shows that when immigrants decide to assimilate, they're more likely to prosper. Remember, they chose to assimilate. Immigrants come because they want a piece of the culture they can't get anywhere else. This can also be seen by looking at a study of Central American immigrants by the Cato Institute, where it said, quote, "The level of assimilation that Central American immigrants and their children achieve is remarkable, given that nearly half of all Central American immigrants are in the United States without formal legal status." In other words, integration of Central American immigrants is occurring despite the best efforts of the United States government to prevent it. This shows that immigrants value assimilation so they can be successful, thrive, and prosper. In the words of Woodrow Wilson, "We came to America, either ourselves or in the persons of our ancestors, to better the ideals of men, to make them see finer things than they had seen before, to get rid of the things that divide, and to make sure of the things that unite." Thanks, and I'm ready for cross-examination.
All right, Adam. I got 3 minutes on the... Oh, there we go. Got 3 minutes on the clock. When you're ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
All right, let's get started. So in your opinion, what does assimilation look like? What does it look like for the dominant culture to value assimilation?
Well, what it means is that I think really what it means is that they show that assimilation or prove that assimilation is more important than multiculturalism in their society.
All right, and you would agree that they're going to do that in quantifiable ways. In other words, there's going to be some sort of encouragement from the minority, from the dominant culture to assimilate.
Sure, I think there's always some sort of encouragement whenever they come to their culture, their country, or they immigrate to their country to become more like the people that live there in the first place.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to your value of prosperity. Now, how did you define prosperity?
Prosperity is, let me just make sure I have it right, the condition of being successful or thriving.
Awesome, cool. And you would agree that our value for this debate round should be the most important thing to this debate round, right?
Sure, yeah. It's the end goal of really what we're trying to achieve, yeah.
All right, cool. Let's look at your assimilation benefits. And you gave this application about the marketplace of ideas.
Yeah.
Now, you would agree that assimilation looks at the minority culture becoming more like the dominant culture, right?
What it does is it makes it so that they become a part of the embracing culture or the dominant culture. That doesn't mean the dominant culture doesn't change at all in that process. It just means that they're now part of that culture.
All right. So if the minority becomes like the dominant culture, you would agree that there is now less ideas in that marketplace, right?
No, not necessarily, because then you're correlating ideas with cultures. My whole entire position is that when you assimilate, then you now have common ground, so you're able to discuss, debate, and these ideas are able to compete in the first place.
All right. Let's look at your second application where you talked about names specifically. Let me clarify. Your main point here was that when you have an American-sounding name, you do better, right?
No, the main point was that through assimilation, when those immigrants decided to assimilate, that's when they were more successful. The naming was simply just a measure to determine whether or not they assimilated.
Okay. And do you believe that assimilation, even if it is beneficial for some, do you believe it would be beneficial to everyone?
I mean, nothing is really beneficial for everyone necessarily. We kind of have to look at the majority of people, I would say. whenever we're talking
Okay.
about these like broad concepts.
Awesome, thanks. No further questions.
Sure.
I'm going to be starting, actually, I don't think I need any prep time. Let's go ahead and get started with this speech. This will be a 7-minute speech by the negative. And when you're ready, Adam.
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, cool. Let's get started then. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. That's what Benjamin Franklin said, and it's why I firmly believe that liberty is the highest value in this debate round, not safety, not prosperity, but rather liberty that I stand resolved to negate today's resolution. And so we're going to jump right into the values here, and I'm going to respond to his value of prosperity with what I just stated. Again, that is liberty. And I have two reasons to prefer the first you can tag as most important. Again, that's most important. If you're being oppressed, you cannot be prosperous. Liberty is more important than safety. It is more important than wealth. Ultimately, liberty is what gives us the rights to do what we want, to pursue our well-being in whatever way best suits us. And so this is the most important value in today's debate round. My second reason to prefer, you can tag as achieves prosperity. Again, achieves prosperity. When liberty is valued, prosperity is achieved by proxy. We can look at all the societies of the world and we see that the most prosperous ones are the ones that value liberty, and the least prosperous ones are the ones that are oppressed, like North Korea, for example. So by valuing liberty, we can get to prosperity. This is what makes it a better value. So now let's move on to my contentions. That is the reasons I believe multiculturalism best achieves liberty. The first one you can tag as multiculturalism upholds liberty. Again, that's multiculturalism upholds liberty. Now, under a multicultural system, your freedom of religion, speech, and assembly is protected and celebrated. You should be encouraged to keep your cultural traits, which are expressions of these different values. Example, the United States. Again, that's the United States. Now, the United States was founded on the principles of liberty laid out in the Bill of Rights, the most important of which are specifically given in the First Amendment. We know these, the freedom of religion, speech, press, and assembly. How does this relate to multiculturalism? Well, freedom of religion grants protection to practice the religion of your culture. Cultures are oftentimes formulated around religious beliefs. Freedom of speech grants you the protection not only to speak your ideas, but can also be applied to language. In other words, you can't be forced to give up your language. You're free to speak whatever you want. And the freedom of assembly also protects our right to assemble together in various cultural communities. In America, we value your right to practice whatever cultural customs you want. And because these are our values, we see people taking advantage of them by remaining multicultural in America. We are an extremely multicultural nation, and we became this way because we valued people's liberty to be this way. So if we want to uphold personal liberty, we need to value multiculturalism because it and liberty are inseparable. Multiculturalism is protected by the Bill of Rights, whose very purpose was to ensure our personal liberties weren't infringed upon. My second contention you can tag as assimilation harms personal liberty. Personal liberty. And I'm going to have two subpoints under this. The first you can tag as China. Again, that's China. Now, China has taken on the policy of assimilation, and the result has been up to 1.5 million people from Muslim Turkic minorities being imprisoned in re-education camps in order to force them to renounce their religion and culture. Eyewitnesses have reported that intensive brainwashing and psychological torture goes on at these camps. Now, this may seem like an extreme example, but it can go to show what happens when the government values assimilation, when the dominant culture values assimilation. Maybe it will never be this extreme, but is any discouragement to practice your beliefs from the government a good thing? That doesn't uphold my value of liberty. My second subpoint you can tag as discrimination. Again, that's subpoint B, discrimination. Now, we can see the devastating effects from government-imposed assimilation, but we can also see the devastating effects when the government isn't involved at all. In my next example, which you can tag as workplace discrimination. Again, that's workplace discrimination. According to Sonia Guman and Ann Ryan, 2013, and I quote, evidence for formal discrimination, interpersonal discrimination, and low expectations to receive job offers in the workplace was found for hijabi Confederates. Furthermore, hijabis when there was low employee diversity compared to when there was high employee diversity, unquote. So by the way, hijabis are Muslim women who wear their traditional head covering. So what does this piece of evidence tell us? It tells us that when businesses value assimilation, they discriminate against the minority culture. This is what assimilation does. It does this by nature. It gives disincentives to the minority in order to make them become more like the dominant culture. That's the only way you enforce assimilation. It essentially says to the minority, you need to give up your culture or there will be punishments as a result. There will be disincentives as a result. And this discrimination on the basis of cultural practices and religion does not uphold my value of liberty. But that's exactly what assimilation does. Now, let's move on to some responses to the affirmative case you just heard. I'm going to have 2 responses to the marketplace of ideas. First, you can tag as assimilation hinders. Again, that's assimilation hinders. When assimilation is valued, the minority culture is becoming more like the dominant culture. What does this mean? It means there's less ideas in that marketplace. It is less important than other ideas simply because those ideas are in the dominant culture. Valuing assimilation hinders the marketplace of ideas, and valuing multiculturalism actually helps it. My second response you can tag as dominant culture isn't always right. Again, that's dominant culture isn't always right. Now, if we value assimilation, we're essentially saying that the minority culture needs to assimilate to the dominant culture. But the dominant culture isn't always right. That doesn't always end well. And so mandating that assimilation happen in these instances doesn't help the marketplace of ideas because the dominant culture isn't always right. And that's the assumption that assimilation is essentially making. Now let's move on to some responses to the name discrimination and to the Central Americans. I have 2 responses. The first one you can tag as multiculturalism wasn't valued. Again, multiculturalism wasn't valued. Now, Adam said that the problem in this instance was that basically, when multiculturalism is valued, it leads to less prosperity, and when assimilation was, it led to more prosperity. But I don't believe this was the problem. I believe that the problem is that multiculturalism wasn't being valued by the dominant culture. There was discrimination against people on the basis of names because multiculturalism wasn't being valued. Whose fault is it that people were being discriminated on the basis of their name? Is it their fault, or is it the people who were discriminating against them? I would say it was the people who was discriminating against them. If you're discriminating against people on the basis of their name, that's not right at all. And multiculturalism says that we need to value people in spite of their diversity, value diversity itself, because different people have different traits and ideas to bring to that marketplace. And so the discrimination here was a result of the My second response you can tag as shouldn't force. Again, shouldn't force. Just because assimilation may result in prosperity in some instances doesn't mean you should force it on everybody, because assimilation, or rather because prosperity looks different individual to individual. Thank you.
Alrighty, I have 3 minutes of cross-examination. Dylan, if you're ready.
Yep.
Perfect, let's get started. I want to talk a little bit about the burdens today. So you would agree that in order for you to prove the resolution is untrue or false, you don't have to show that we shouldn't value assimilation at all.
Right.
So in the same way, I don't have to show we shouldn't value multiculturalism at all, correct?
Right.
So in today's debate round, we're not really looking at extremes, and we're not looking at the extreme end in which one is valued to the detriment of the other, correct?
Well, I think one can be valued to the detriment of the other, and that's something that has to be taken into consideration on both sides. So, I mean, I'm not saying that we should only look at extremes, but I'm saying that extremes can tell us a lot about an ideology.
So let's say we valued liberty so much that there was no laws and no order. Would that be good?
Well, I would say that wouldn't be valuing liberty, because liberty is limited by itself. In other words, you can have liberty in so much as you aren't violating other people's liberty. And so by having no laws, you actually aren't violating liberty, because you're allowing people to tread on other people's liberty.
Interesting. So, but just for the sake of the analogy, I understand your point. But I guess what I'm saying is the extreme side of liberty isn't good, right?
I believe that if liberty is purely valued to its end, then I believe that that would be a good thing.
Okay, interesting. Moving on to the point talking about, you talked about the United States, and you essentially said that in the United States we uphold liberty, and it's because of multiculturalism that we uphold this liberty?
My point is that multiculturalism and liberty are inextricably linked, and we see this in the United States. You can't have one without the other.
Right, so you would agree that liberty is inherent to the culture within the United States?
I would say that the United States is characterized by a valuation of liberty, sure.
Okay, so would you agree that there is a dominant culture in the United States?
No, because liberty isn't a culture. Just because you value liberty and I value liberty doesn't mean we share a culture.
Interesting. So it's your position that there is no dominant culture in the United States.
No, there isn't.
Okay. Moving down to your application of China. In China, do they value multiculturalism at all?
I don't see any way in which they do.
Okay, so you talked about discrimination. Is it your position that if we value multiculturalism, there won't be any discrimination in the workplace?
I would say that's the ideal, sure. If we're valuing multiculturalism, if we're valuing other people's right to practice their culture, then that runs counter to the definition of discrimination. If you discriminate against someone, that means you are intolerant of their culture. And if you value multiculturalism, well, that can't happen.
Right. So essentially, it's your position that when we value when we value assimilation, we're intolerant to other people's cultures.
I'm saying that valuing multiculturalism brings down discrimination. I'm not saying that assimilation, I'm not saying to each individual who values assimilation necessarily discriminates. I'm saying that when the culture as a whole values assimilation, they enforce that via discrimination.
Okay, thanks. No further questions. I'll be using a minute of prep time. Alrighty, so with 4 minutes on the clock, I'm just going to assume everyone's ready and get on with this rebuttal. There's a lot of points I need to get to, so I'm just going to go straight into it, starting with the value of liberty. My response is that prosperity includes. He himself said that that in order for us to value prosperity, we have to achieve liberty first, and that prosperity is really the end goal. So when we're looking at prosperity, it includes liberty. However, it's my position that assimilation doesn't harm liberty, and I'll get into that by responding to a couple points. My first advantage, he's had two responses. The first one is that assimilation hinders. My response, take in and understand. One thing that's really important is that he didn't respond to the definition that I presented to kind of clarify what assimilation is in this advantage, where it talked about that assimilation is taking in and fully understanding information and ideas. But his second response was that the dominant culture is not always right. My response is that assimilation allows for competition. Again, assimilation allows for competition. If we all stay separated by our cultures and don't assimilate into the common ground of one culture, then that competition isn't going to happen. And even though the dominant culture might not always be right, guess what? If we don't assimilate other cultures, we're not going to be able to change because there won't be that difference of ideas and that competition. Against my second advantage, he talked about how multiculturalism is not valued. And then he talked about how you should force. I have two responses. You shouldn't force. I have two responses. The first one is that naming is a measure. Again, naming is a measure. I want to read you the evidence. The evidence didn't say that having an American-sounding name conferred genuine economic and social benefits. What it said is that having an American-sounding name was a badge of assimilation that conferred genuine economic and social benefits. We have to understand that in this example, the names reflected a broader assimilation process, and it was that broader assimilation process that brought them prosperity. Because if you go to public school, if you learn the language, follow the laws, and become part of a society, you're more likely to succeed within that culture. But moving on to the idea that you shouldn't force, my response is not forced. Central American immigrants assimilated, even though the government doesn't want them to because they're illegal immigrants. Why are they assimilating? Because they understand it's the best thing to do for their own prosperity. Moving on to his case, his first contention talked about the United States. I have two responses. The first response is that freedom is a part of U.S. culture. Again, freedom is a part of U.S. culture. Essentially, he's saying the biggest problem with this whole entire argument he's made is that he's confusing individuals with cultures. The fact of the matter is that if you come to the United States and you value freedom, if you value prosperity, if you value all these things, liberty, religious freedom, then you're part of American culture. That's why American culture is so great. You're assimilating to those ideas. But my second response is Central American immigrants. The idea that America doesn't have a dominant culture is impossible because assimilation happens under Central American immigrants, an example he didn't respond to. His second contention, first he talked about China. My response is it's an extreme example. Why is it an extreme example? Because multiculturalism wasn't valued at all. My second response is it's too much of a good thing is always bad. Again, too much of a good thing is always bad. There's not really a single thing other than maybe human rights that I can think of that it taken to its extreme isn't bad. What does that mean? It really doesn't get us anywhere to be looking at extremes. The extreme of multiculturalism, where we're all secluded and isolated, is also bad. So what? Extremes don't actually prove or determine value systems. But moving on to the discrimination point, I have two responses. The first one is individual, not cultural harm. Again, individual, not cultural harm. Discrimination is done on an individual basis, and the fact of the matter is that the culture as a whole did not discriminate against them, even though assimilation was valued. But my second response is multiculturalism won't fix. I don't care what country, what culture you are, whether you value assimilation or multiculturalism, discrimination is never going to go away. It's a fact of life. It's evil, it's bad, but it'll always be there. In the end, what we've seen is that assimilation doesn't limit liberty, but rather it protects liberty and prosperity. And for that reason, I believe the resolution is still true. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to use my 3 minutes of prep time now. All right, I'm all done with prep time. This will be a 6-minute speech by the negative, and I'm going to assume everybody is ready and get started. Nelson Mandela said, "My dream would be a multicultural society, one that is diverse and where every man, woman, and child are treated equally." Unquote. This is what multiculturalism is about. It's about treating other people differently in spite of our differences. Instead of demanding that everyone conform to one big societal norm, but rather allowing for that marketplace of ideas that Adam mentioned in his first speech. So let's get on to some responses. First, in response to my value, Adam said that prosperity includes liberty. You can tag my response as can't have without liberty. Again, can't have without liberty. This is important to understand for today's round because all I'm trying to show is that if I prove that assimilation violates liberty more than multiculturalism does, then it thus harms prosperity. It thus harms the most important value of this round, which Adam agreed we should look at the most important value, which I believe is liberty. And if I prove that that's harmed, then a negative ballot is warranted. Now let's move into some responses to my case. First, Adam said that that we're all one big U.S. culture in America. You can tag my response as freedom isn't a culture. Again, freedom isn't a culture. Sure, as the United States, we all generally value liberty, but liberty isn't a culture in itself. Beliefs are a part of culture, but they aren't culture in itself. Like I can value liberty, and a Brit can value liberty, but we don't share the same culture. So America doesn't share the same culture in this sense. In response to Central American immigrants, you can tag my response as let them choose. Again, let them choose. Assimilation may benefit people in some circumstances. I agree. But multicultural circumstances. And you'll find that when you let people choose, more often than not, we'll see people choosing to remain in their own cultures. That's what we see in America today. That's why we have so many cultural enclaves in our country, because people have chosen to remain multicultural, and they should have the right to do that. In response to extreme example and too much of a good thing, you can simply tag my response as irrelevant. Again, irrelevant. It's irrelevant if China valued multiculturalism. That doesn't mean it's not an example of assimilation. In fact, it's a perfect example of assimilation because it proves that they valued assimilation over multiculturalism. And what happened? A lot of bad things. In response to individual, not cultural, you can tag my response as cultural pressures. Again, that's cultural pressures. What assimilation does is it exerts cultural pressures on the minority, and that manifests itself in the form of discrimination or oppression. And so we see that cultural pressures do result in discrimination from this piece of evidence I brought up. In response to multiculturalism won't fix, you can tag my response as valuing eliminates. Again, valuing eliminates. When the dominant culture values multiculturalism, when they value the presence of multiple cultures, they're not going to discriminate against people on the basis of those cultures, because that runs opposite of the definition of multiculturalism. Now let's move back through the affirmatives case. In response to taken and understand, and about his clarification of assimilation, you can tag my response as the actual definition. Again, the actual definition. The actual definition of assimilation is becoming part of a community or culture, or I'm paraphrasing, but essentially it's one culture becoming more and more like another culture. And what does that mean? It means those differences are being lost. That marketplace of ideas is being lost. That's what assimilation does, is it decreases differences and thus hurts the marketplace of ideas. In response to assimilation allows for competition, you can tag my response as simply, no, it doesn't. Again, no, it doesn't. Assimilation wants the minority to become more and more like the dominant culture, so it doesn't allow for competition in this respect. In response to naming as a measure, you can tag my response as, it's not a good one. Again, it's not a good one. Now, my name is Dylan George. That's a very English and Welsh name, but I'm not assimilated to English and Welsh culture. Likewise, you could have a very Asian name or a very African name and yet be completely assimilated to the United States general culture or dominant culture in our country. And so naming isn't a good measure for assimilation at all. The problem in this piece of evidence was that there was discrimination on the basis of names. In response to not forced, you can tag my responses to the dominant culture enforces. Again, the dominant culture is going to enforce assimilation on the minority, whether it be via the government or via social pressures. And this harms people's liberty to practice the beliefs that they want. Now, I want to give you 3 quick voting issues to leave you in this speech. You can tag my first voting issue as liberty is vital. Again, liberty is vital. We can't even think about having prosperity until we first achieve liberty. Liberty is the most vital value in this debate round, and so we need to be looking solely at that first before we can even look at anything as it pertains to economic prosperity. My second voting issue, you can tag as reject social pressures. Again, that's reject social pressures. does is that it's the dominant culture pressuring the minority to assimilate. And this is going to manifest itself in the form of oppression or discrimination, like I brought up in my example of China and in my example of businesses. This is what valuing assimilation does, is it hurts the minority's rights to practice what they believe to be the truth. And you can tag my final voting issue as allow for competition. Again, that's allow for competition. Multiculturalism wants to allow for competition. Multiculturalism says that no culture is better than another. Multiculturalism says that every culture should be allowed to practice their own beliefs so long as they aren't violating other people's right to practice their cultural beliefs. Multiculturalism is only limited by itself. You can't get too much of it because, again, Adam's example of basically lawlessness is not going to happen, because if you truly care about cultural freedom, then you're going to put restrictions on people's ability to hinder other people's cultural freedoms. So multiculturalism and liberty are only limited by themselves. And so because I believe that multiculturalism best achieves liberty and assimilation harms people's right to practice their culture, that I urge a negative ballot at the end of today's round. Thank you.
Alrighty, so no further prep time needed. Wow. I'm not going to use any prep time. So with 3 minutes on the clock, I'm just going to assume everyone's ready and go ahead and get started. There are really two main arguments in this round, and these two arguments are going to be my voting issues. The first voting issue you can tag as assimilation doesn't harm liberty. Again, assimilation doesn't harm liberty. So let's go to the specific arguments under this voting issue. Let's go first to my second advantage. He talked about how it's not a good one, specifically talking about how naming is a measure. I have two responses. The first one is that experts disagree. This was a study by Stanford saying that names were a good way to determine whether or not they were assimilated. And he brought up these different examples, but this is a good option or a measure of assimilation according to these experts in the context of the study. My second response is it's a new argument. What I mean by this is his argument before was that naming was a discriminatory, or that they were discriminated because of their names. Now it's that as a whole, the methodology of the study was bad. That's a new argument. The fact of the matter is that they were better off because they assimilated. But moving on to the idea about let them choose and that the dominant enforces, my response is they did choose. Again, they did choose. The fact of the matter is these Central American immigrants, not through any pressure of the government, in fact, the opposite, chose to assimilate. They were illegal. The government didn't want them to assimilate, yet they did. Why? Because it shows that immigrants themselves value assimilation. This is really important. This whole entire debate round, my opponent has taken the side of the minority, saying that for their liberty, we can't value assimilation, but the minority themselves disagrees with them, something that hasn't been responded to this whole debate round. But let's go on to the point about the United States in his first contention. He said that freedom is not a culture. My response is that freedom is a part of American culture. Again, freedom is a part of American culture. The idea that America doesn't have a dominant culture that is foundational, that is founded by freedom, by religious freedom, economic freedom, whatever, freedom is just doesn't really make sense. The fact of the matter is freedom is a part of Americans' culture, and when you assimilate to that freedom, that means you expect that freedom. But moving on to the idea of China, he said it's irrelevant. My response is then we can't value anything. And then we can't value anything. What I mean by this is, again, any good thing, no matter really what it is, like 90% of the good things that are out there can be taken to an extreme. Does that mean that we should just throw them out? No. This is the point that I was trying to make. This argument is not an argument for determining a value system. All he's proved in is that the extreme side of assimilation is bad. So is the extreme side of multiculturalism and like 90% of the other things that we value. The second voting issue is that assimilation is more important. In response to the marketplace of ideas, he talked about the actual definition. My response is that the definitions aren't mutually exclusive. Again, the definitions aren't mutually exclusive. He didn't respond to the definition that said assimilation is taking in and fully understanding. And then finally, talking about the discrimination is inevitable. It doesn't matter what your culture values, discrimination will occur. In the end, assimilation doesn't limit liberty, but is more important for prosperity and ultimately needs to be valued highest. Thanks. I'm the only one.
Good job, Adam.
That was a really
Thank you
good...
all so much for judging, too. We really appreciate it.
Thank you both for a great round.
All righty. Thank you so much for your time, guys.